So now we would like to open up the discussion, and of course we can receive questions through President Akinami and also through Kushi as well. But at the same time, I would like to invite any kind of comments or questions. So please. Very good. Yes, please. Yep.
I'm going to still start with my mantra of saying that we need to change the way we measure progress. And if we don't do that, we'll still be caught up with this drive for affluence, with the way we define affluence, which is material wealth. And it was interesting when we did the Satayama assessment. There was an interesting graph that came out from the Ministry of Environment, which they did a census of the population, a relatively large census of the population. And it was interesting that they saw a switch between an aspiration for material wealth. There was a Caesar effect that turned around somewhere in the I'm kind of trying to recollect, but I suspect somewhere around 1985, where people's aspirations for material wealth switched to spiritual wealth. And then I matched that. And then I matched that with what the GDP was in 1985. Mm-hmm. And it came very close to what many in the literature have found out, that at about, and it's very surprising, it's a very low figure. It's about approximately 8,000 purchasing power parity, so you adjust for the purchasing power of the country, about $8,000 US dollars. For Japan, it was even slightly lower, where people said, we don't want any more. The marginal the marginal value of the extra dollar for whatever you call it, well-being. I would use the general term well. And this was the turning figure, 70, 75. Some countries even lower than that. So I'm wondering how we can use that. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I wish I was. But what my friends sort of say is you need to take on what companies do. They call it a social marketing program. Just like smoking companies did with the Marlboro Man. And many other things, with Coca-Cola and stuff. Is governments need to basically even take on that for changing the mindset of what really it's about. I'm kind of convinced that unless we change from the GDP or income, we kind of get caught in what is in the literature called hedonic treadmill. We keep trying to keep.
The average income of this area was about 3 million yen annually, which means that it's about $30,000 annually, which is almost a half of Tokyo. And even when you take this prefecture of this area, which is called Iwate Prefecture, the average of Iwate was about 4 million, or 40,000, which means that this Sandik area along the coastline was even lower than the average of this prefecture. So in an economic sense, well, by having these numbers, you might say, oh, this is poor area. But when it comes to the life of this area, I'm sure that the story is quite different. So I think that's where, one of the issues that we have to think on.
So the reason why the income is low is because of either because of they have the hidden income, or they are satisfied with the
I would say it's a hidden income. Yes.
Yeah. It's Richard Esterlin who published that paper. And he will counter your argument by saying it's hidden income.
Yeah, because we had a close interview with the people there, refugees. And what they were talking was, before the tsunami occurred, it was almost like every day that fishermen comes to their place and say that, these two fishes are too slow to go to the market, so I give it to you. Yeah, and then you have some other people who are working on the field and come back to their house. On the way back, they drop in at the house and saying that, these radishes are too small, I will give it to you. So that kind of system was working there. before. And then these people were relocated to the new habitats. And then that kind of system collapsed. And now they're complaining that
you need some kind of internal PPP standard, because clearly 1 yen outside Tokyo is worth more than 1 yen in Tokyo, if only because of the differential cost of accommodation. So the comparison is distorted by cost structures in ways that are familiar to anyone who lives in a capital city, even within the market paradigm. In addition, you might want to discuss things outside the market paradigm. So the comparison is clearly not as unfavorable as it sounds, even on a pure income basis.
Exactly.
But the points I wanted to make were a bit different. I'm struck by several things in the way you presented it, including the question on the slide, how to design the future. Is the future the kind of thing that can or should be designed? Resilience and restoration are quite different concepts. You could almost argue that they're the opposite. Let me just affirm some axioms here without going into a lot of detail. And a reasonably short-term restoration paradigm removes the opportunities for resilient adaptiveness or adaptive resilience. Again, I don't know what to do with these ideas, but it does seem as if one really dreamt of a resilient society, probably that's not the way you would do it. Past the emergency restoration of basic services, which is indispensable for survival. But of course, we live in societies where the idea of putting things on hold for a while we think about options is seen as defeatist or negative. The desire to have the first flight within a month, give it certain features that are actually very different from the kinds of features that are built naturally into a planning approach to restoration. Sorry to dump all this on the table with no attempt to make it coherent. And one final point. Cost-benefit analysis is typically very bad at handling risk. Not least because risks tend to be based on occurrence of past events rather than serious assessment of the range of possible future uncertainties. Redundancy, therefore, appears as a cost, whereas in fact redundancy is an asset, risk-adjusted. There is a methodological issue about cost-benefit analysis that needs to be built into these issues. And I was very struck by your earlier anecdote about shops and supplies. The fact that short supply chains were robust in ways that long supply chains were not. Now, short supply chains are more expensive in some respects, but the redundancy built into them would actually, on a seriously risk-adjusted basis, appear to be beneficial. Do we have the analytical, technical capacity to do the right kind of risk-adjusted cost-benefit analysis to make
hidden costs? Actually, as Professor Yokohari mentioned, normally in the rural area, the people produce a lot of the vegetables and rice and crops, and they also share the fishes from the fisher people. And actually, I myself did the survey last November in the Noto Peninsula. It's not the Tohoku area, but it's we found similar practices all over this kind of rural area, and we found that in terms of rice production, more than 60% of the people produce by themselves in-house. So they consume the rice produced by themselves, and they also share, like 15% of the people share the rice from the neighborhood. So they only buy like 10 to 20%. So their dependency on the rice from the outside of the market is only less than 20%. And in terms of the vegetables, they only depend on the 40% of from the market. So they in-house production and the shared production is about nearly 60%. And in terms of the meat, they need to buy most of the meat from the market. And in terms of seafood, they for example, they catch by themselves like 30%, and they share, they get from the neighbor, the fishermen from the neighborhood, like about 30%. So they only buy 40%. And also some fruits, they self-produce about 40%, and then 20% they exchange with the neighborhood. So that they only buy 40% from the market. So that's a kind of, I think this is kind of higher end of the one of the community who maintain such practice. So I think that this percentage is kind of higher end of that kind of practice. But still, I think those practices are more or less.
Nations are now trying to invent new measures of whether it be OECD or some NPOs. But for instance, is there any possibility that, for instance, we include that kind of hidden profit? Is there any prospects that we can find something new to compare? Because, for instance, the present ruling party, also in Japan, now the biggest aim is annual 2% increase of GDP. It's the present status in Japan, but we cannot maybe still find the appropriate substitutes.
Yes, please.
Efficient and effective way. I mean, in 2004, there was a tsunami in the Indian Ocean. And it was a different event geologically, in a different society, and so on. But I think if you were to compare, and I don't know if this has been done, if you were to compare the impact and the response and the consequences, even today, and the same number of years, say, later, of these two events, I think you would find an enormous difference. Why? Because this country is so incredibly wealthy. It's in some ways, in my travels around the world, my impression is Japan is in some ways the wealthiest country in the world because of the investment in the countryside itself. This is a structured country, and that has gave it the ability to recover, very quickly. The loss of life and suffering, of course, were terrible, and people suffer, anywhere in the world when something happens to people close to them or to them. But in terms of the infrastructure, the cities, the way people live, their ability to recover, it's the wealth of Japan, it's this GDP that has allowed it, and we knew this. Did anybody doubt this when we saw what was happening? That Japan would recover because it could. Not just for economic reasons, because of the way the society is, the unity, the education, the culture, the governance.
But I think the resilience of this country is not because of the income, it's because of the people. So we should not make this one-to-one relationship with income makes the people. The people of Japan have a very strong tradition even before this massive increase in, I would say, material wealth. Because the term wealth means a lot of other things. In the latest literature, when we talk about wealth, and even with David Pearson, that's good to when you talk about wealth, we talk about human capital as well, which goes more into than just income. So it's not material wealth. And I think it's actually, it comes down to the people, and that's what we tend to forget in this massive calculations of just numbers. It's people and the way that they react to hardships and shocks. And Japan was always criticized for first it was 1 decade or one lost decade, and then it went on to 2 lost decades, based on the fact of GDP.
Yeah.
But those 2 were not lost decades because it was building up its other forms of wealth. And that was what I think helped Japan in terms of reacting. Because if you see the after impacts of the tsunami versus what happened in New Orleans, there you had rivals looting.
With their former Kobe earthquake. And Kobe is a very economical important place, and the price of land is very high. And it is sort of waste to leave land unused for a long time. And comparing to that, in contrast, in this region, the land price is almost zero, sometimes negative to the situation. And then, if you see tomorrow, the area is a big parking lot. Nothing happened there. But after a few years in Kobe, for example, 10 years, you don't see there's earthquake. I mean, there don't see any clue. There was earthquake. And I was so shocked about economical power. However, this is a one chance or task that we have to think about economical growth, definition of their matureness, or definition of their, well-being. What is that? That's what. And this is one very good occasion for sustainability scientists, to think about big construction and people relationship.
Yeah, and also I have to say that now our population is starting to shrink. And also, as you know, our life expectancy in Japan is the longest in the world, which means that the average age is about 80-something. Which means that in the very near future, the demographic pyramid will become like this one, upside down pyramid. Which means that we will be having a huge portion of elderly or retirees, which we won't be able to support anymore financially. And I would say that this is sort of, this area, the Atlantic area, is a sort of front runner in that sense. We used to have already, before tsunami, we used to have a huge portion of elderly, and it was depopulated. And how to recover, how to restore the society. Because on one hand, it's been told that those cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and also some other western part of Japan may have another major earthquake in the very near future. Maybe it's going to be today, tomorrow, a month later, 10 years, 30 years, we don't know. But it has been projected that, for example, Tokyo, the major earthquake, the percentage, the possibility of a major earthquake hitting Tokyo is about 70% within 30 years. So it's a very, very high chance that Tokyo will be suffering from a major earthquake. And if that occurs in the places like Tokyo, where you have more than 10 million population, this will be a major risk. This is.
So you say the people is the critical role. Therefore, the education is very important. And what is required to education in Japan is to learn much more about tolerance. So maybe education system is good, but we feel the reason that I said yesterday, if the people feel happy or not, in Japan it's very low. The reason is maybe people in Japan don't feel that they can do what they want to do. So to learn.
I think that one of the major philosophical events of the European 18th century was an earthquake. The Lisbon earthquake of, I can't remember whether it was 1758 or 1759, which destroyed much of Lisbon and caused a famous philosophical controversy between Voltaire and Rousseau, where Rousseau tried to make the argument that the best way to be resilient in the face of natural disasters was effectively to abandon civilization. Because as was known even at the time, earthquakes don't usually kill people directly. Falling buildings kill people, and fires, and the indirect consequences of earthquakes. On the other hand, the position taken by Voltaire and many others was that it was precisely civilization which made societies vulnerable to earthquakes, which also gave them the capacity to cope with them. In other words, the Rousseau position, which is basically to quote material wealth and collective identity. Maybe there's less of an opposition between the two positions than a complementarity. Anyway, I'm rambling, but maybe the point is clear.
Yes, please, yep.
Well, I hate to have this GDP versus not GDP discussion go on forever, but I would like to ask you, Ananta, for a little bit more detail about what the Inclusive Wealth Report actually said about Japan. You mentioned earlier this morning that the natural capital was the only country that had increased. And so tell us about the education component, the people component, and the wealth component.
So, for the benefit of the others, the term inclusive wealth basically captures three forms of capital. Natural capital. And natural capital then starts off from the health component. It was really huge, which you would assume it would be, because the whole idea, the way we computed was the value of a statistical life, i.e., how much are you willing to pay to live 1 year long? For some, maybe, for some would be negative, but for most of us would be very high. So that was kind of an outline, but we're still working on methodologies. We're kind of right there on the frontiers of research. But the one on education is interesting because that's where we captured a lot of the demographics, because you talk about age structures, and you talk about the level of
In terms of the accumulation of the natural capital, but we are not fully utilizing, particularly after the World War II. This has brought us serious issues in the rural areas, including affected areas. So, is it acceptable for you or not?
No, the reason is because the value is not captured properly, because you say it's not utilized, but you're only utilizing it looking at from a timber perspective.
Okay.
But what we did was we also captured the regulating services and the cultural services.
Well, I'm sorry I have to leave soon.
Oh, yes.
Because I have to catch a train. But just referring to that point, just let me give you a brief example of what we calculated in the one town which has been referred already, Otsuchi town, as right over there. This town has been destroyed by tsunami again, and most of 80% of the land area of the city has been destroyed, and this is how far tsunami came in. And about 10% of the whole population lost. And this is what happened right after tsunami. Okay. Now, this town, Otsuchi town, about 90% of the town area is forest, as you see here. It's covered by forest. And we estimated that how much biomass we can harvest from this forest and how far this biomass will be covering the energy demand of this area. And it's a very simple calculation. So we have three scenarios. The first one is to cover the whole area of this town, which goes all the way into deep mountain. The second scenario is old Otsuchi area, which used to be Otsuchi in the past, but now Otsuchi has been joining other local municipalities, so maybe you can watch. So the second scenario is old Otsuchi, and the third scenario is only the maritime area, which is nearby the town itself. And we estimated that how much the biomass can be harvested from those forests, and at the same time we estimated that how much energy has been used for cooking and also heating. And we tried to calculate how far this energy for cooking and heating can be covered by annual harvested biomass from those forests. And this is a number that we came up. If you're trying to use whole Otsuchi area, 1,200% can be covered of the amount of energy we need. Old Otsuchi area, still 400% in a local area, but we simply neglected, especially after the Second World War. So these 50 years to 60 years, even though we did have this potential, we simply neglected because we thought that everything can be replaced by petroleum, the fossil fuel. But once you have, rediscover the system to utilize this biomass, then, well, it's a very simple calculation, but there is a potential. So I'm sorry, but I have to catch the train, so I will ask Fukushi to take the role. And well, thank you very much for
Thank you.
Now, I'm taking take over the chair position.
My request is asking to the student and young researchers
Yes.
to give us some ideas. Because it's also very important.
I have been waiting voice from the wind, the wind. But come on, I mean, they're welcome to.
There is no free lunch.
Introduce the polio, which causes so much of the problems with the health.
I want to make a contribution about the debate about this.
Could you speak a little bit louder?
You can use a microphone.
I think when you're talking about resilience, you also have to consider vulnerability because also somehow determine the resilience, how a community is resilient to a certain disaster. And to me, we have different levels of vulnerabilities. We have social vulnerabilities, we have natural vulnerabilities, and we also have environmental vulnerabilities, which eventually contribute to resilience. And when you consider the social vulnerability, and in that aspect, social resilience, you can talk about what Anad was talking about, the culture or the tradition of the values that the community has. And especially Japan is really good in that. But when you're looking at the structural vulnerability, or physical vulnerability, like how often earthquakes normally occur, like in Japan is very vulnerable. Then you have to consider resilience in terms of income that the country has, because you have to have this income to build strong structures. This, for example, cannot be in a position in Haiti.
Thank you. In your opinion, is there conflict? Please.
I have been very interested in visiting this area for a long time because I've been trying to understand. Can you hear me?
Your microphone.
Populations respond to risk. I am doing my thesis at the moment on disaster risk reduction through education, and as such it's really interesting to consider using Japan as a comparative study for the situation in Mexico. I've been visiting schools in Tokyo, for example, and seeing how children are taught to protect themselves and how they are capable of responding to the most basic needs. And I have read a lot, especially Daniel's Aldrich studies on social capital that are being taken place around this area, which is really interesting for further information on what the tsunami meant in social terms. Well, so Daniel Aldrich was presenting partial results of his investigation, and education was one of the aspects that he considered. It is really interesting to take this to economic terms, particularly because, yes, most of my case studies in Mexico are very poor areas where the dream of having infrastructure to protect themselves is, well.
And so, if you want to measure progress of society, that's what we're talking about. This is a very macro level on what is the indicator that we should use. That's where we have the issue of whether it should be just material wealth or income. There are a lot of other things that come important, and this is why a lot of the studies done by not straight hardcore economists, but the social sciences in the broader sense, talk about this $8,000 thing where that other issues become very important. So I think that's critical. That's why we took this notion of the three forms of capital. So countries which have very, very low produced capital, i.e. infrastructure, tend to have a problem. Countries which have,
meaning that the ability to protect the assets of the poor, which are typically very small, is crucial to their capacity to withstand environmental disasters without being dragged into extreme poverty because of them, which implies that the asset base, more than income, respect to them, and if so, what do the results look like?
Quite interesting question.
Very quickly, we had Saudi.
Oh, you have?
You have.
Yeah.
And then what does it look like?
It was negative.
Negative.
Even accounting for capital gains from oil, because they are oil. Nearly all the oil exporting countries, when we did on per capita, were negative. Venezuela, Nigeria is as institutions, but it's also institutions are really critical here. That's where we have to emphasize that institutions are extremely important. And in Japan, institutions work very well, both at the formal and the informal community levels, especially. But Saudi was negative.
And as you know, through another matrix, is it Nicholas Taleb who published this? With the idea that Saudi Arabia is, in terms of his framework, the most fragile state/society in the world, based on a different approach, but reaching similar conclusions and basically using the same information. Just an interesting side of that.
Yeah, I think that in a way this test case that we're using here, this natural disaster, maybe should raise our sights a little higher and look at some other risks which are much bigger, and ask ourselves how resilient would this or any other country be, given that the probability of these bigger threats is not all that negligible. Let me mention three. Okay? One is collapse of the global financial system.
Technology-led innovation. But in the world now, the world of expression of social innovation is very popular, but not yet in Japan. But this kind of how to face with the new risks and so on. There are many things to consider. And somehow I just idea is so as a catch copy maybe, so
Yes, Jack.
Unless, did someone have a question from Tohoku?
No.
No? Just a quick response in response to what Stefan just said, which I think does give one pause and thought, but I remember from the UNESCO Symposium that we were at in the discussion on resilience there, that one thing to bear in mind when we're talking about resilience in the face of natural disasters is also never to lose sight of this notion of tipping points, which also is relevant in the context of the disaster, the potential disaster that you just mentioned as well. I mean, there's a tipping point at which societies are led into war. There's a tipping point in terms of the financial system. But that's also true in terms of ecosystems. And I think that's one of the reasons why this case study remains, whether we see it as positive or not, but exploring how one approaches resilience is crucial in terms of what societies around the world are facing today. And that it has implications that go beyond environmental considerations too, but I think it's the notion of ecosystem.
How to incorporate traditional knowledge in Tohoku, tsunami tendenko is an old phrase. People translate from generation to generation. When they anticipate tsunami, they need each person decide by themselves and then just run away by themselves, not as a group. When you anticipate tsunami, just that kind of practice has been transcended by generation by generation, and traditional knowledge actually work at the much level. So how we can really transcend that kind of traditional knowledge, but at the same time, as we discussed in the morning session,
Just prevention.
In Sendai plain, different. No, that means there's no medication. Okay. Problems. But it's a fact.
Now, I've been grappling with this notion of local and indigenous knowledge and stuff. So let me be a little bit provocative here. So, all right, so kids now are in the digital age.
Yeah.
Then you're sort of saying the old traditional knowledge tends to be a little bit more in terms of what word?
Verbal.
What would that be? The
Verbal.
verbal. But these days, yeah, kids don't talk it. Normally they're even going on a date and they are doing texting next week. I understand, but anyway, that's the new generation. The question is, so do we tend to go back to that system, or do we set up systems that will maintain that digital age
of the same thing? And if you look at the way in which imaginative literature has tried to deal with the question of radical vulnerability in the face of the kinds of things that Stefan was referring to, what's striking is that what tends to be imagined, think of a novel like Cormac McCarthy's The Road, for instance, or Stephen King's The Stand, which is basically the same story but told by very different kinds of writers, both in the context of a pandemic. In one case described, in the other simply the background. What is shown is the disappearance of society as a collective agent, and therefore the disappearance of any possibility of resilience. Not necessarily government, not necessarily the state, but the society is capable of imagining itself changing. And therefore the question would become, what are the conditions under which, even in the face of extreme stress,
social and special social education and so on, I didn't get a clear picture about what the ideas were in the region for dealing with the aging population issue in new and creative ways in the reconstruction.
Well, for example, each local government has to have a master plan, how to reconstruct.
Right.
We have tentative master plan that was developed by consultant. But by involving community, we have to have a blueprint, and still that process has not been able to draw the blueprint. And because of the population, new what is their life? What can we control? And that's why there is some discussion to integrate several communities. But that is sometimes they're not feasible at this point. But how we not really convince, future we have to a master plan will be made in the next 30 years at least. So the disaster planning in the 50 years, and how to put it there. Our agenda.
So tomorrow we will have a chance to discuss with the local officers.
Tomorrow we'll have
including the aging issues of the population issues in their reconstruction plan.
Tomorrow
This is a very important point that we need to observe. And then,
tomorrow afternoon we have some. And tomorrow evening we have again, have a theory, after whole thing, we have 2 hours of again, workshop at
with food and drink or without?
I don't know. We have to ask so, And then at that time we want to have a specific, discussion about this, Gretchen's question, and I have also a question. I want to have some hint. And Professor Takeuchi is in a position to give a suggestion to local government and central government, and we really want to have the opinion. And from that, we want to have how the sustainability science is contributing by sort of their getting the knowledge from natural science and social sciences, and maybe work together.
Okay.
Professor Takeuchi,
originally I was requested to summarize the discussion, but still we are discussing. And then maybe after looking at the reality of the situation, where we visit tomorrow, and then we could get more ideas. And tomorrow evening would be a good opportunity for us to summarize our discussion. And so